Chester County, South Carolina. Another school year begins. The high school population here is half black and half white.
Many of the two, they gonna come out of these doors like mad.
Jeff Brown is the principal. It hardly seems remarkable today, but only 35 years ago, an integrated school with a black man as principal, not only would it have been unthinkable here, it would have been against the law. Few of these students realized that once there were laws which would have kept black and white children out of the same schools, off the same buses, and not too long ago, they couldn't even legally share the same drinking fountain. This is Chester County then, during the era of segregation, the era of Jim Crow. These old scenes were shot by a brilliant but little-known black lawyer, Charles Hamilton Houston. In 1934, Houston crisscrossed the South documenting inequalities between schools for whites and schools for blacks. Charles Hamilton Houston would lead one of the great legal campaigns of the 20th century, the struggle to destroy Jim Crow. A struggle whose crucial victory would come in the landmark 1954 Supreme Court decision, Brown versus Board of Education. Today, few people know the name of Charles Hamilton Houston, the man who killed Jim Crow. But this is his story, and the story of how African Americans won for themselves the equal protection of the Constitution. This is the story of the road to Brown. The road to Brown begins in Jamestown, Virginia, just 12 years after the first permanent English settlement in the New World. There, in 1619, 20 African slaves were sold into bondage. It wasn't long before colonial laws were defining black slaves as property, not people. When the American colonists declared their independence in 1776, they boldly asserted that all men are created equal, but they didn't include the slaves. The Constitution of the new United States of America specifically permitted slavery to continue. In 1857, the Supreme Court reaffirmed the exclusion of African Americans from the Constitution. In the Dred Scott decision, the Supreme Court ruled Negroes were, quote, so far inferior that they had no rights which the white man was bound to respect. The Dred Scott decision set the stage for the Civil War, a war fought, as Abraham Lincoln said, to determine if this nation could endure half slave and half free. With the North's victory, slavery was finally abolished by the 13th Amendment to the Constitution. The 14th Amendment then granted all citizens equal protection under the law. And then the 15th Amendment gave black people the right to vote. But in 1877, as federal troops were withdrawn from the South, state legislatures began passing new laws to undo the gains African Americans had made under the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. As with Dred Scott, the Supreme Court would give constitutional sanction to racial discrimination. It was in 1896, in a case called Plessy versus Ferguson. It was this sanction which Charles Houston would dedicate his life to overturning. In 1895, black people in Louisiana decided to test the constitutionality of the new laws. One segregation law required separate railroad cars for Negro passengers. Homer Plessy sat down in a car reserved for whites and was arrested. Because of the 14th Amendment and its equal protection clause, Plessy never imagined the Supreme Court would rule against him, but it did. The court upheld his conviction in a decision which would shape race relations for half a century. In Plessy versus Ferguson, it ruled, the 14th Amendment could not have been intended to abolish distinctions based upon color or a commingling of the races.
And the tragedy of Plessy is that having then held that you could discriminate on trains, the doctrine then was applied to a whole host of other areas, to all public accommodations, to boxing matches, to education, and in some instances, in the early years, in housing. And it gave the imprimatur that the law in America could do to blacks what it couldn't do to Irishmen, or Italians, or Jews.
The Plessy decision introduced a new phrase into the language, separate but equal. 21 states would soon pass segregation laws under the protection of Plessy. The turn of the century saw the existence of two Americas, one white and one colored. Colored America could not eat in white restaurants, play in white parks, die in white hospitals, or be buried in white cemeteries. Oklahoma even segregated phone booths. Mississippi segregated Coke machines. In Atlanta, a Negro witness could not swear on white Bibles. Florida segregated not only the schools, but even the textbooks in storage. This was the era of Jim Crow.
This little song that I'm singing about, people you all know is true. If you black and gotta work for a living now, this is what they will say to you. They say, if you's white, she's alright. If you's brown, stick around. But if you's black, oh brother, get back, get back, get back.
The promise of the 14th Amendment, the promise of equality before the law, had been derailed. And in practice, many black people had been removed from the protection of the law altogether. The Jim Crow era was a time of unprecedented racial violence. Over 2,000 African Americans were lynched in the first years of this century.
Southern trees bear strange fruit, blood on the leaves and blood at the root. Black bodies swinging in the southern breeze, strange fruit hanging from the poplar trees.
This was the divided America in which Charles Hamilton Houston grew up. He was born in 1895 in Washington, D.C., 1 year before the Plessy decision.
One of the interesting things about Charles Houston is that he had come from a privileged background, privileged in relationship to the majority of African Americans in the United States. He had come from a family in which his mother had at one time been a teacher. His father was a lawyer. His father was the head of his own law firm. Charles had an opportunity to attend a high school that was designed to prepare black students for college.
Houston went to Amherst College in Massachusetts, one of the only black students in the school. He graduated summa cum laude at the top of his class in 1915. He left school acutely aware of his minority status as a black man, but he had no plans for a life of legal or political activism. That was about to change. Along with 200,000 other black men, Houston volunteered for duty in World War I, the war to make the world safe for democracy. But he served in a segregated army. Although Houston was an officer, that didn't protect him from Jim Crow. He and the other black officers were given substandard housing, next to a latrine. They were often restricted to base and harassed constantly. Overseas in France, Houston even had to face off a lynch mob of white soldiers. Houston later would write, "The hate and scorn showered on us Negro officers by our fellow Americans convinced me there was no sense in my dying for a world ruled by them. I made up my mind that if I got through this war, I would study law and use my time fighting for men who could not strike back."
Thus, Charles Houston began to see even more clearly that it was the administration of law, the lack of justice, it was a primary concern for him, so that when he went to law school, he fully intended to begin to study the law with a view towards being able to use the law to change that situation for his people.
In 1920, Charles Houston took his first step down the road to Brown. He entered Harvard Law School. Houston became the first black editor of the prestigious Harvard Law Review, and one of his professors, future Supreme Court Justice Felix Frankfurter, called him one of the most brilliant students he'd ever taught. After graduation, Houston undertook a survey of black lawyers. In the entire South, he found fewer than 100 black lawyers serving 9 million black people. Houston wrote in the Journal of Negro Education, "The great work of the Negro lawyer in the next generation must be in the South, and the law schools must send their graduates there and stand squarely behind them as they wage their fight for true equality before the law." Houston realized that a legal challenge to the Jim Crow laws would require a cadre of young black lawyers armed with a zeal for social justice. Houston got the chance to forge this team in 1929. He was appointed Dean of the Howard University Law School. Houston raised the standards, improved the faculty, strengthened the curriculum, and got the school accredited. From Maryland came Thurgood Marshall, a tall, gangly youth who would become the first black justice on the Supreme Court. From Virginia, there was Oliver Hill, who would become the first black to be elected to the Richmond City Council. Houston's own cousin, William Hastie, joined the faculty and would later become the first black federal judge. Charles Houston, was gathering the forces to fight a war, a legal war, against Jim Crow.
What he did was to use the law school as a breeding ground for testing issues on the faculty with the students. And then as Houston began to be called upon by lawyers and communities across the United States, then the United States became the classroom, his classroom.
Houston was ready now to take on Jim Crow. Only one thing was missing. Houston needed an organization linked to the black community, an organization capable of broadening the attack on Jim Crow. That organization would be the NAACP.
Segregation is our enemy. It must be removed. Segregation is our enemy. It must be removed.
The National Association for the Advancement of Colored People had been founded in 1909 in response to the rising tide of racial violence. Charles Houston was appointed special counsel in 1934. It was now almost 40 years after the Plessy decision. Most people accepted Jim Crow as a permanent part of American life. But Houston had seen a weak spot in Jim Crow law. In a memorandum to the NAACP National Committee, Houston outlined a strategy for overturning segregation. The battle, he believed, could be won if fought in the schools. Houston wrote, "Discrimination in education is symbolic of all the more drastic discriminations which Negroes suffer in American life. The Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment furnishes the key to ending separate schools." Houston proposed a two-stage attack on the separate but equal doctrine of the Plessy decision. First, he would build up precedents proving that separate facilities were not equal. Only then would he attack the principle of separateness itself. Juanita Stout, the first black woman on the Pennsylvania Supreme Court, began her career as Houston's legal secretary.
And he devised a strategy, first of all, when he attacked the separate but equal theory. His real thought behind it was that, all right, if you want it separate but equal, I will make it so expensive for it to be separate that you will have to abandon your separateness. And so that was the reason he started demanding equalization of salaries for teachers, equal facilities in the schools, and all of that.
The week after his appointment as special counsel to the NAACP, Houston picked up a movie camera and headed for the back roads of South Carolina to document the inequalities between black and white education. Within 3 months of becoming special counsel, Houston had made a film, got a strategy approved, and filed his first case against the University of Maryland Law School. Jim Crow was being taken to court. Donald Murray had been denied admission to the University of Maryland Law School, the only law school in the state, on the basis of his race. Charles Houston brought suit in municipal court. When the day came to argue the case, Houston asked the community to dress up and attend the trial.
We crowded that courtroom on that day in June. I'll never forget it. Charles Houston and Thurgood Marshall started off with their case. And the judge never even having left the bench, was so moved by the logic and the simplicity of Charles Houston's words and Thurgood Marshall that he ordered the University of Maryland to admit Donald Gaines Murray to the University of Maryland Law School. The judge said, this young man has been denied his constitutional right to enter that University of Maryland Law School too long. Your constitutional right is personal, present, and immediate.
The court ordered the state of Maryland to admit Murray and integrate its law school. Houston's legal campaign had scored its first major victory. Charles Houston targeted teachers' salaries next. Teachers had long held the most respected positions in the black community, yet their salaries were a fraction of their white counterparts. Houston knew their support would be key in mobilizing black communities in the South for the larger fight against Jim Crow. Majeska Simpkins taught school and was NAACP secretary for many years in South Carolina.
I was up at the bank, standing in line to get my check cashed. And there was a white teacher about 3 in front of me talking. They were just talking in line. And in the course of the conversation, I found out that she was teaching 6th grade. When they counted out the money to her, she was getting exactly twice as much as I was getting, and both of us were teaching 6th grade. But her hide was white and my hide was black. Now that went on in the South for years and years. Well, no matter what you were doing, the white man's work was just more valuable than the black man's work, no matter what category of labor or profession it was. So we went up for equal salaries.
In case after case, Southern school districts were forced to equalize teachers' salaries. Black teachers saw their paychecks double. Support for the legal attack on Jim Crow grew. The next step on the road to Brown would be the Gaines case.
Charles H. Houston brought this case seeking his admission into the law school. That is the only time in my life, grade school, high school, college, or graduate school, or professional school, that I ever cut class. But even though I was a teenager, I had heard of Charles H. Houston, and I had a lifelong ambition to be a lawyer myself. And when I heard that Charles H. Houston was coming to Jefferson City, Missouri, I cut class and went to the Supreme Court of Missouri that day, and I was thrilled.
Gaines was a citizen of Missouri, and he had the temerity to believe that since the state had only one law school, that he should be able to attend it. But the Missouri Supreme Court, tragically, in a unanimous opinion, that state court said, that since there were schools available in Nebraska and in Illinois and in Iowa, which would accept blacks, that Gaines would have to go to one of the schools bordering Missouri rather than to go into his own native land.
But now Houston could appeal the Missouri court's ruling to the Supreme Court. A decision here would apply to all the states.
And by a magnificent opinion by Chief Justice Hughes, they held that that was a violation of the Equal Protection Clause. That even if a state was going to provide separate education, it couldn't provide separate education outside of the state.
With the Gaines victory, the precedents against segregation were mounting higher and higher. Jim Crow was headed for a showdown in the U.S. Supreme Court.
working for no more Jim Crow over me, over me. And before I can be a slave, don't you know I'll be a buried in my grave and go up home to my Lord and be free, and be free.
In 1940, after 6 years as special counsel, Houston left the NAACP. His former student and assistant, Thurgood Marshall, was named as his successor. Together with other NAACP lawyers, Marshall continued to challenge unequal facilities in graduate schools in case after case. Meanwhile, Houston switched his attention to attacking segregation in transportation, public accommodations, housing, and labor. These cases provided additional precedents for the final assault on Plessy. One of these cases attacked preferential hiring in the railroad industry.
The reason that you had black firemen in the early days was because that was the lousiest job you could have. You're stoking coal. And it was an ugly job, and it didn't pay too very much, but all of a sudden, you got diesel engine. All a fireman has to do is pull this lever, and sit and enjoy himself. Well, you can imagine what the whites, how quickly they went after those jobs. Well, Charlie Houston was a genius. He won a case called the Steele case, and where that was declared illegal for the white union to negotiate to give the jobs that the black firemen had to white firemen just because they were now easy jobs.
It seemed as if Charles Houston never rested. He sued to integrate the armed forces and defense industries after World War II. He served on President Roosevelt's Fair Employment Practices Commission, wrote a regular column for the Baltimore Afro-American. He testified before Congress, led protests, marches, and rallies.
Oh, freedom, oh, freedom.
Houston was cautioned by his doctor to cut back on his work. His already weak heart had been aggravated by the stress of his travels and endless litigation. But although his heart condition steadily deteriorated, Houston worked his normal 14 to 19-hour days.
It was interesting to me to watch this man work. Shirt sleeves, an old eye shade on, his door open, bent over, a big book, reading it very closely and making notes. This was his method day in and day out until he had achieved what he wanted to do. The thing about Houston that impressed me so much was the fact that he did not realize his own greatness.
And before I can be a slave, don't you know I'll be a man in my grave and go up home to my Lord and be free, and be free.
Charles Hamilton Houston died of heart failure on April 22, 1950. He was 54 years old.
Over me, and before I can be a slave, don't you know I'll be a buried in my grave and go up home to my Lord and be free, and be free.
There was just a sense of such a loss and almost a sense of how could this have happened to a man who did so much good and whose life was still needed. And he literally, I mean, you talk about somebody who literally gave his life for the cause because he had this heart trouble, heart attack, and the doctors told him that he had to rest, and he said, I can't rest. And then he had a favorite saying he used to say, I would rather die on my feet than live on my knees. And he literally died on his feet.
2 years after his death, Charles Houston's strategy to end legal segregation was put to the final test when Brown versus Board of Education was argued before the Supreme Court. The precedents chipping away at the separate but equal doctrine had been mounting up. McLaurin, Sweat, Sippuel. The time had come to raise the stakes, to put the very idea of separate on trial, to prove that segregated schools could never be equal. Seven-year-old Linda Brown had sued to be let into a well-equipped white school just a block from her home, instead of having to cross railroad tracks and walk a mile to an all-black school. Brown versus Board of Education was not just her case, but 4 other desegregation lawsuits from all parts of the country consolidated by the Supreme Court into one critically important national case. Thurgood Marshall had become the chief coordinator for the Brown strategy. Once Houston's student, now Marshall stood in Houston's shoes. He was chief counsel to the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. For this most important case of all, Marshall relied not only on his expert team of NAACP lawyers, including Constance Baker Motley, Robert Carter, Jack Greenberg, Lewis Redding, and Arthur Shores, but he called upon the leading scholars and educators in the nation. Charles Duncan, then just 2 years out of law school, remembers the round-the-clock strategy sessions preparing for the case.
A sense that you were participating in the most serious event that you could be involved in as a lawyer, and we were all very conscious of the effect it would have on the lives of black people and Negroes, as we were known as in those days, and incidentally on the country as a whole. And it was an all-or-nothing effort from a legal point of view.
Opposing Marshall as chief counsel for segregation was John W. Davis. Davis had argued over 140 cases before the Supreme Court, more than any other attorney in this century, a formidable, world-famous legal opponent. On December 9th, 1952, spectators filled every seat in the Supreme Court, and 400 people lined up in the corridors, hoping to hear the foremost legal minds argue about segregation and the meaning of the Constitution. Thurgood Marshall and his team argued that segregated schools marked black children with a stamp of inferiority and affected their ability to learn. They argued that such suffering denied black people the equal protection of the law guaranteed by the 14th Amendment. John W. Davis's argument relied on the Plessy decision to justify segregation. He felt confident it would yield him yet another legal victory.
He was of the opinion that all of the precedents were on his side. Well, what he really meant was that he had Plessy Ferguson on his side, because he had failed, it seems to me, in thinking that he could win the case, to consider the build-up by all of the other cases that the NAACP group and others were mounting.
For 17 months, the fate of segregation in America hung in the balance.
We shall
On May 17, 1954, the Supreme Court handed down the decision that Charles Houston had begun fighting for 20 years earlier. In a unanimous decision, the Supreme Court ruled in the Brown case to separate children solely because of their race generates a feeling of inferiority that may affect their hearts and minds in a way unlikely ever to be undone. In the field of public education, separate but equal has no place. Separate educational facilities are inherently unequal. Any language in Plessy versus Ferguson contrary to this finding is rejected. It is so ordered.
May 17th, 1954, I was downtown, and over the radio came a unanimous Supreme Court. Voted today that racial segregation in the public schools is inherently unequal and unconstitutional. I was so thrilled. It was just like being born again. It was tremendous. And the people were coming out in the streets. They couldn't believe that we had won.
Oh, happy day. Oh, happy day. Oh, happy day. Happy day. Oh, happy day. Happy day. Oh, happy day. Oh, happy day.
Just as after the Civil War and the passing of the 14th Amendment, a white backlash followed. Southern states defiantly upheld their segregation laws despite the Brown decision. The South waged a campaign of delays, obstruction, and violence they called massive resistance.
This nation was originally constituted as a government of laws, not of men. We are going to find out if this is still true.
Some politicians paraded their racist sentiments, and some state legislatures even declared the Brown decision unconstitutional. Across the South, a resurgent Ku Klux Klan, often with the support of local police, terrorized anyone who tried to implement the Brown decision. But the grassroots movement Charles Houston had envisioned began to build, now with the Supreme Court behind it.
Justice, Lord, come on.
A dedicated civil rights movement pressed an often reluctant federal government to enforce not only the Brown decision, but the Constitution itself. The social revolution intended by the 14th and 15th Amendments 100 years before began to sweep the South. John Lewis, the son of an Alabama sharecropper, was arrested 40 times during those struggles. Today, he represents Atlanta, Georgia in the U.S. House of Representatives and remembers.
During that period, I saw people literally grow up overnight. Young people, young black people sitting in at a restaurant on a lunch counter, ride on a bus to Montgomery, marching in Selma or in the streets of Birmingham, grow up because people start saying the law is on our side.
Each night on television, the civil rights movement educated all of America about the meaning of the Constitution. The whole country had finally become Charles Houston's classroom. Charles Morgan was a civil rights attorney during those turbulent years.
Major events. And all over the United States, every night was election night, and every night people in the United States watched the news, and every night they made up their minds. And as they made up their minds, they forced the Congress of the United States to confront the issue, make up its mind, and pass the civil rights bills.
One by one, the barriers set up by Plessy and Jim Crow crumbled. In 1956, Montgomery buses are integrated. In 1957, a reluctant President Eisenhower orders troops to protect black students integrating Little Rock schools. In 1960, students sit in at segregated lunch counters. In 1961, Freedom Riders integrate interstate buses. In 1964, Congress passes the Civil Rights Act, and in 1965, Congress passes the Voting Rights Act.
Keep on talking, marching up to freedom land.
Birmingham, 1990. As a result of Charles Houston's campaign and the civil rights movement it helped to launch, the political balance of power across the South is changing. Birmingham, once the city where fire hoses and biting dogs attack civil rights demonstrators, now has a black mayor. Donald Watkins is special counsel to Mayor Arrington of Birmingham, as well as 3 other Alabama mayors.
You know, we stand here in front of the governor's mansion and we can look right over there at the guard station, and you'll see black guards there who would not have been there except for litigation that was filed in the early 1970s, recent United States Supreme Court cases. So laws can change the quality of life. Civil rights lawyers can give life to those laws. We got plenty of laws on the book, but if you don't have lawyers who are willing to go in the courtroom and battle for these individuals, all you have is a bunch of empty words and phrases.
The laws are different now. Thanks to Charles Houston and others, laws no longer keep these Chester High School students out of the same schools and off the same buses. Legal segregation is over, but the legacy of Jim Crow remains. 1 of every 3 black people lives in poverty. Only 2 of every 100 elected officials are black. 4 of every 10 black students do not finish high school. The road to a just society, the road Charles Houston took us so far along, did not end with Brown. It is a road present and future generations of Americans must continue to travel.
I do it because I owe that to all those people who died, who got beat, who marched, who didn't have big names and fancy titles and fancy degrees, who held the doors open for me at the University of Alabama. I didn't get in the University of Alabama because I was the smartest black person. There were smart black people long before Donald Watkins who couldn't get in simply because of their color. And it's my obligation and it's my duty, just like I believe it is the duty of every black lawyer who's out here in private practice, to take up his or her fair share of the civil rights cases, and I'm going to do it as long as I can talk, walk, speak, think, hear, and practice as a lawyer. I'm going to make sure that I can keep the door open for as many other people as I can, just as the door was kept open for me.
In 1949, 5 years before the Brown decision and 15 years before the 1964 Civil Rights Act, Charles Houston made a prediction and expressed his hopes for the future.
There come times when it is possible to forecast the results of a contest, of a battle, of a lawsuit, long before the final event has taken place. And so far as our struggle for civil rights
is concerned, the struggle for civil rights in America is won. What I am more concerned about is the fact that the Negro shall not be content simply with demanding an equal share in the existing system. It seems to me that his historical challenge is to make sure that the system which shall survive in the United States of America shall be a system which guarantees justice and freedom for everyone.
Lift every voice and sing till earth and heaven ring, ring with the harmony of liberty. Let our rejoicing rise high as the glistening skies. Let it resound loud as the rolling sea. Stony the road we trod, bitter the chastening rod, felt in the days when hope unborn had died, yet with the